Good evening, everyone, and I want to welcome you to tonight's conversation, Redeeming Social Media, Christian Reflections on Using and Building Social Media More Wisely, presented by the Octet Collaborative. My name is Nathan Barzey, and I am the Executive Director of the Octet Collaborative, which is a new Christian study center serving MIT. The Octet Collaborative is working to build a community of students, faculty, and staff at MIT dedicated to human flourishing as formed by the historic Christian faith. We're seeking to promote a culture of wisdom at MIT that promotes the human flourishing of the community members inside and also promotes the human flourishing of all people throughout the world through the impact of the work that MIT does. You can learn more about us at octetcollaborative.org. So one of the ways that we seek to pursue our mission is by hosting important conversations like the one that we're having tonight. Before I introduce the topic, let me just make a couple logistical notes. And some of these things are showing up in your chat right now. We're gonna have about an hour of conversation with our panelists. And then at about 8 o'clock, we'll switch things over to audience Q&A. In order to keep things simple here on Zoom, the way that we'll do the Q&A is with a website called Slido. And again, there are instructions for this in the chat, but what you do is you go to slido.com and you'll be asked to enter the code Octet, O-C-T-E-T. And then once you're in there, you can submit questions and you can also upvote questions. If you see one that you think I have that question too, you can just vote that one up. And that way we'll see which ones are generating the most interest. We'll be reminding you of this as we go along in the chat window. So now to the topic for the evening, redeeming social media. So concerns about social media and its role in our society have been very much in the news recently and really over the last several years. Concerns about disinformation and its impact on public health or the integrity of our elections, concerns about internet addictions, concerns about cyberbullying. Most recently, there was a series of articles in the Wall Street Journal called the Facebook Files, reporting that internal research from inside of Facebook indicated that its platform could have damaging effects on the mental health of teenage girls and others, that it contributes to political divisions around the globe. As recently as yesterday, the whistleblower who had provided all the documents that these articles were based on was testifying on Capitol Hill about her experiences as a Facebook employee. So Facebook, or Meta, as the company has renamed itself, they've been in the crosshairs the most over these last couple months. But the concern is more general than that. There's been a growing sense that social media is potentially doing more harm than good. Recent articles, there's been several titled "How to Fix Social Media" or something like that. These have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the journals of both Stanford Law School and Sloan Business School here at MIT, and the New Atlantis, which is a journal about technology and society that's one of our speakers tonight has published a lot of his writings there. So that's kind of the background for why this conversation is so important. But in the middle of this context, we want to ask the question, what can Christians do to help? It's not possible to turn back the clock. Social media isn't going to go away. So given that it's a part of our world, and given that Christians are called to love and to serve and to bless the world because God loves it, how can Christian faith and practice make us wiser users of this technology? What kind of wisdom can we apply ourselves? What can we apply for our children or the other communities that we're a part of? And what about Christians that are actually working for tech companies, as many who graduate from MIT will be? What can they do to serve the world in this arena. Well, I can't imagine three people that I would rather talk to about this topic more than the three that are joining me tonight. Two of them are among the most insightful Christian thinkers, observers, theorists that I've had the pleasure of meeting or reading on this topic. And one of them, and I'm really excited about this, one of them is a follower of Jesus who works for one of the big tech companies. That kind of perspective is one that doesn't often show up in conversations like this, but it's really integral to the kinds of conversations that the Octet Collaborative wants to promote. We are, after all, at MIT. Applied knowledge is central to MIT's DNA. It's right in the motto, mind and hand, for MIT. So we're really excited to host this conversation between leading thinkers and builders in this space. Let me make one necessary disclaimer before I introduce them, and that is simply to say that, of course, the opinions that our speakers will present tonight are their own personal opinions and don't represent the positions of the companies or the institutions that they work for. So with that, let me introduce our panel. First of all, we have Felicia Wu Song. There she is. Hi, Felicia. So Felicia is a sociologist. She studies the social and cultural effects of digital technologies on community and identity in contemporary life. So she did her training at Yale and Northwestern, and then her doctoral studies at UVA, University of Virginia. And today she serves as a professor of sociology at Westmont College. She has just come out with a new book. This came out 2 days ago, I think. It's called Restless Devices: Recovering Personhood, Presence, and Place in the Digital Age. That's out from InterVarsity Press. I wish I had my physical copy here with me. I made the mistake of ordering it from an old-fashioned bookstore and actually have to go there to pick it up. But I did get to see an advanced copy when we were together about 6 weeks ago, and I can really recommend this book. So our next panelist is Michael Sacasas. Michael, hey, Mike. Michael is the associate director of, oh, he's got it.
Thanks, Mike.
There's the book. He's the associate director of the Christian Study Center at Gainesville, Florida, and the author of The Convivial Society, which is a newsletter about technology, culture, and the moral life. His work has appeared not only there, but in the New Atlantis, Breaking Ground, Real Life, The New Inquiry, and Mere Orthodoxy. And he's the author of a forthcoming book entitled 41 Questions, Technology and the Good Life, which is based on an essay that you wrote at the Convivial Society. I guess you originally wrote these 41 questions about 5 years ago, right?
That's right, yep.
That's right, yep. So I'm looking forward to seeing that book come out. Last but not least, Nick Kim. Hey, Nick. So Nick is a technical project manager at Google. He drives engineering projects for YouTube, and he's also a member of the Google Christian Steering Committee. Nick is also involved with global missions organizations with a heart to supercharge missions and innovate on ways to serve the nations. Here's my favorite part of his bio. Nick is a superhero by night and a father of 2 biological sons and an adopted daughter by day. Nick, that makes it sound like you're a superhero by night and day, but I'll go with your description. So Nick is based out of Mountain View, although he currently lives in Orange County with his wife and his 3 children. So welcome to all of you. I am really excited to have this conversation. Felicia, I wonder if I could start things off with you. So I mentioned that we were together 6 weeks ago. We were at a meeting in Madison, Wisconsin. And I really loved some of the stories that you told about your work as a professor teaching undergrads, and just some of the things that you have seen over the course of your career at the impact that social media is having on your students. What would you say has been really notable? What are some of the biggest changes that you have seen in your students just over these last, say, 10 years?
Yeah. So I teach a class called Internet and Society. And every time I teach it, one of the assignments that we start off with is a digital fast, where I ask the students to go 24 hours without any digital. And I'd say when I started the assignment, I was always expecting a lot of groans, just like agonizing, like, are you kidding me? How can I go 24 hours? And that's what it was in the early days. But I'd say about in the last 3 to 5 years, there's been a shift, right? Where students are a little nervous about having to do the fast. But one, they're familiar with the idea now, right? It's what people do. Celebrities do fast, they do detox. It's in the culture now. But a lot of them are also increasingly like intrigued and interested if they've never done it. And so I think what I'm finding is that students now are aware, just in their own lived experience, of some of the downsides of social media. A lot of them are just tired. They're just like literally physiologically exhausted because they go to bed with their phones, and they feel stuck. They're not sure, like they don't know what to do. Like, how can they stop using these technologies? So I think there's just been an interesting arc in seeing students before that were fairly optimistic, fairly kind of skeptical even about doing a fast, to students now being much more open and much more interested in just seeing, well, what can I do? What possibilities do I have to get unstuck from this life that I have?
That's great. So we might come back to some questions kind of like that as we get into the question of, what are some concrete practices that we could adopt to make us wiser as use of this technology. But Mike, let me turn to you. I mentioned your post, your essay, 41 questions. By the way, that essay got some interest from Ezra Klein over the summer. So Ezra Klein, the columnist, journalist at the New York Times, he's also got a podcast called The Ezra Klein Show. And he had Michael on the show. Was it over the summer, or is that just when I listened to it? It was in this past year.
It was, right. I think was published in early August.
Okay, yeah. Had a great conversation. So after this, not now, but after this, if you want to go listen to more of Michael, you can punch up the Ezra Klein Show and listen to that great conversation. I actually wanted to ask you one of your own questions. These are really great questions to ask of any technology. And just kind of starting at the top of the list, you begin by asking a series of questions that all kind of get at the idea that we don't just form technology. Technology forms us. It impacts us even as we use it. And so the very first question that you ask is, what kind of person will this make of me? I wonder if I could ask you, I don't want you to get more personal than you want to here, but I wonder if I could ask you, how would you answer that question for yourself? How has your use of social media formed the person that is Michael Sacasas?
I didn't realize it was a session of confessional. So the one social media platform that I somewhat reluctantly allow myself, and I use it knowing that I'm sort of making a kind of bargain with the devil, at least that's how I framed it to myself, as Twitter. And I would definitely say that, it has its advantages. I think of it as a kind of an investment in my writing career to be on there. But by the same token, I also sometimes describe it as a kind of tax on my attention, on my not only cognitive capacity, but also my emotional life. And then, so that it it adds a kind of measure of anxiety, I think, if one is on Twitter a bit too much. I remember this experience in the early days of the pandemic, way back in January and February of 2020. And I think there was definitely a sense of information without context, anxiety about what the future was going to hold, and a kind of search for information that just wasn't actually going to do what I thought it was going to do. So I think it creates certain expectations about how you might be able to navigate this world, kind of foregrounding the amount of information you would gather from the outside world. There are a variety of ways, I think, in which the platform has inculcated unfortunate habits in me, even as I am aware of that potential and kind of try to moderate the consequences of the use of that technology.
Would you, overall, it sounds like on balance, you're finding benefit from being there. And
I'm
so
not sure how I would put the balance. Yeah. There is a decided advantage in the sense that I've connected with people.
Right.
I'm glad I've connected with. It has seeded certain relationships over time, and even with people who I've never met in person. And I think over time you still get the sense that you have a genuine relationship with this person, simply because of the persistence over time of the interactions. And so it undoubtedly comes, I owe a lot of the opportunities I've had as a writer about technology to the platform. So there are definitely advantages, but always weighing that against the costs that come with it that I think are, and really this is a point I want to stress about this question, but what sort of person will the use of this technology make of me? That in some respects, the answer to that question is irrespective of the particular uses you're putting the technology to, right? So however guarded I might be about the content that I'm experiencing, that I'm allowing myself to see, however well I might curate my feed and block or mute certain voices on the platform, however virtuous I may attempt to be in terms of what I am posting, my experience on that platform is still going to have a kind of formative effect on me, and the effect is never something that is generalizable to everybody, right? So there's this combination of the person and the particular platform. Twitter will shape me in certain ways, Facebook will shape me in certain ways, but it may have a very different effect on someone else, right? So there's always a way in which it gets calibrated dependent upon the user and the affordances of the specific platform. But the effect will be there, and I just think that part is inevitable.
Great, thank you, Nick. I'd like to actually start with a question that backs up a little bit and gives a little bit of background into who you are, and some of the things that you're really passionate about. I've had the opportunity to listen to you speak about a more general question, which is, what does it mean for a Christian to integrate their faith into their work, right? Because if we're asking questions here about, what kind of a difference can a Christian who works for a tech company make, sort of presumes the question that, well, what does Christianity have to do with work at all? Would you mind just giving us a little bit of your perspective on, I've heard you talk about how integrating faith with work isn't just about sharing the Christian message at work. It's not just about tithing. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think what you're alluding to is evangelism and tithing, and how that's been the central theme of faith and work integration. I think those two things are super important. They shouldn't be minimized, but I believe that there's just more to it than just that. I think a good way to frame this discussion, and it's a super deep discussion about what the two would look like when they blend together, but I think a simple way to frame it would be to look at them as two different worlds. You've got your faith world and you've got your workplace world. And in those two worlds, you've got resources and culture. And those two things are very different in these two worlds. And I believe as the two start to merge, there's really two main themes that happen. One is an exchange of those resources, and the second is a growing or a maturing of the Christian. The exchange is really looking at the resources in each world. So if you look at the workplace resources, you've got, for me, technical skills or business acumen or innovation frameworks, problem solving methodologies, all these things that make you successful at work. And then in your faith world, you've got resources. So let's use resources as a bucket of things that are valuable. And so in the faith world, you've got scriptural wisdom, you've got an intimate relationship with God, you've got a purpose that's bigger than yourself, you got a perspective on life, knowing having a security of where you're going to end up. And those are valuable assets that you glean from walking with your faith. And so what we could do is exchange these two. How much of a blessing can we be to the workplace if we can help them see some of the things that we see in the faith-based world? And conversely, we can take some of the resources on the workplace side of things and bring it to, let's say, ministries. I mean, a lot of different ministries that I know are led by seminarians and theologians, and unfortunately, they're not the best executors at things. They know the Bible inside and out, but managing a project or managing finances or taking a thing to market or understanding technical skills, those are second to them. But if we can take some of the skills in the workplace and apply them to ministries, how much better could we operate those ministries? How much more efficient can we be? And then the second piece is about growing the Christian. And I believe as you look at your faith and work and as they blend together, the thing that's happening is a maturing of your faith. And as a Christian, I allude to 1 Corinthians when Paul talks about to a Jew that he was a Jew so that he could win more Jews. To the weak, he was weak so that he could win more of the weak. And what he's really talking about is third culturalism. That's really being able to adapt and flex who you are so that you can connect with the individual that you're trying to speak to. And so when you've got a culture of Silicon Valley, which is heavy performance, heavy meritocracy, then you've got the culture of faith, which is all about grace and mercy. Those two are polar opposites. So a Christian going and bouncing from back and forth, what you're going to end up being is a master of both sides, being able to shift back and forth. Now, if you're taking your faith culture and trying to jam it into your workplace culture, that's not going to really work well. And that's not being very loving either. But as you can understand how the culture of your workplace operates and what's valuable to them, understand their language, now you can connect on a more fruitful level. And so, I think it's really those two main buckets. And I know this is super high level, but it's really the exchange of those resources and the maturing of the Christian.
Great. Well, let me follow up with one question just to make it a little more concrete, and then we'll get even more specific as we go along. If you were pretend you're talking to like an MIT student, undergrad, grad student, but somebody who's about to graduate and is about to head into the kind of career that you've got, what advice do you have? Like, what are the specific things you would say, you need to focus on X at this stage in your training to prepare you to be able to pursue this career wisely, in a way that's like, you talked about kind of bridging these different cultures, which that's a challenging thing. What are the kind of specific nuggets that you might offer someone from your perspective where you are in your career now?
Yeah, I think someone coming right out of college, I think the first thing that I would lock onto is have them read the parable of the talents. That's a story in the Bible about being a good steward of your talents and multiplying those talents. And I believe that everything that you have in your life, whether that's the skills that you've garnered from MIT, to the ability that the fact that you have hands and feet, all those skills are for the glory of God and to his goodness and to his honor. And not to say that your work is going to be a means to getting money so that you can pay the pastor to do the real Christian work. It's really what you've been given. All those things are for the glory and the goodness of God. And so having that perspective first lets the person go into the workplace thinking that everything here is purposeful and everything is not just a means to an end. And I think that's critical, because a lot of people separate the two and say, this is my work life and this is my faith life, and those are completely separate things. And I don't see that anywhere in scripture saying that these two should be apart from each other. So I think that's really the first. And as you start thinking in that manner, then you start to see how other skills that may seem more secular, like the fact that programming, like how can we use that for the kingdom of God? Well, I believe there are plenty of ways, but then we get stuck on figuring out how that can look like, and you end up building another Bible app, which might not be useful if you have plenty of them. But I think, the perspective of, being a good steward to all the things that you've been giving, I think that's critical. And then from there, let the Holy Spirit kind of work and figure out what those expressions could look like.
Great, thank you. That's super helpful. So let me ask a question. Let me just throw it open to all. I'd love to get any and all of your thoughts on this one. So one question that has come up as I've read and thought about this topic is, in some ways it seems like social media has been this huge game changer, has changed so many aspects of our lives. But at the same time, you could kind of say that for other technologies. You could say that for television when it showed up, radio when it showed up, the printing press, when that was new. Want to go back that far? Is there something fundamentally different about social media technology that has led it to have a greater impact and should be cause for more potentially concern, or at least for more focus from Christians about this question about how to use it well?
I think I'd say that each one of those, and you can push that back even further, even to the invention of writing, which had momentous consequences, both for the human psyche and for society and how societies organize themselves and for the shape that memory takes. It's not a matter necessarily of social media being significantly different in kind from these other transformations. It's just that each transformation in our media ecosystem has had profound consequences, and they have varied depending on the kind of technology that we're talking about. One difference may be that we have a kind of awareness now about the transformations as they are happening. I think of I sometimes think of a dialogue in Plato's Phaedrus as being the urtext of tech criticism, where Plato's reflecting through the character of Socrates on the impact of writing, but this is already happening quite a long time after the introduction of writing into human society. Right, we're having now conversations about the meaning of this technology and how it's changing our society, historically speaking, in real time. Right, and that itself is a kind of consequence of the technology, right? That it allows us to become aware of societal and global changes as they are unfolding, and it adds I'm afraid Facebook has ruined this term forever, but it adds a kind of a level of meta reflection into our society, which can be good in that it allows us to maybe navigate certain changes a little bit more thoughtfully, but it certainly comes with a cost as well, right? Where the self-awareness can be paralyzing, both at a social level and an individual level. And in many ways, I think we can describe some of the disorders of our public sphere in terms of the immediate awareness and the level of discourse that has kind of wrapped itself around events, even as they are happening and unfolding. So it's a question of understanding the dynamics that this particular technology has introduced, and not forgetting along the way that it has built upon, in Western society anyway, on the changes that had already been wrought by print, by writing, by print, by electronic media like television. And then there's a kind of overlap as well too, that some of the assumptions we brought into the world of social media were assumptions that were shaped in the era of televisual media, of film and television, and that there was always kind of this interplay between that old world that had been before the introduction of the advent of the new media, and then it'll take a while for the singular dynamics of the new medium to manifest themselves.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think, yeah, every technological jump definitely shakes humanity. But specifically, Nathan, to your question, yeah, I believe social media is a game changer in that it is vastly different than the other technological advancements that we've seen. And the main reasons are I can think of three right off the top of my head: immediacy, scale, and there's a middleman. Now with the writing with written text, there's no middleman. If I write something down and I send it to you all, then that, there's an advancement in that content that's lasts forever, for example. But there's no middleman to broker the dissemination of that information. Now, social media does amazing things in terms of giving a voice to a lot of people. So that's that scale topic. And I think that's extremely important for diversity, for innovation, and for all the times that we had voices that were held down. Now we can magnify the important voices. The danger is now when the middleman is optimizing for the lack of a better term, a bad outcome, right? If you're optimizing for something that is gonna maybe be more engaging, you might be elevating voices that might not need to be elevated, depending on where your moral compass is or what you think is good for society. And because that middleman is there, that puts a lot of onus on that middleman to optimize for the right things. So when I look at different means of communication, whether that's video or whether that's stored films or text messages, there's a growth in innovation that's more or less linear. But then when you look at something like newsfeed, like Facebook's newsfeed, that is something that we can't do in reality at all. If we're in a room, there's no way we could have a newsfeed on the wall, for example. Newsfeed is a truly innovative way to communicate at scale with a middleman that's necessary to curate the contents that's coming to us. This is truly a game changer that could not be possible without the internet. And with that comes a lot of responsibility and a lot of power. And so, yeah, game changer, definitely. And I think there's, that's why Facebook's been in the crosshairs a lot, because they totally changed the game of communication.
And it's interesting. One of the articles that I mentioned earlier that was titled "How to Fix Social Media." So I'm thinking of the one that Nick Carr wrote in The New Atlantis. This is Nick Carr, who also wrote The Glass Cage and The Shallows. That was one of the things that he focused on as to why social media would. He was talking about basically policy prescriptions, but it was that idea of you've got communication between two people, but there's someone in between, who can shape how much of that gets through, what gets through. He focused on the secrecy aspect. They can see it on its way. So it's interesting that you bring that up. That was one of the things that he highlighted. Felicia, what are your thoughts about this? Game changer?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a game changer. For me, the things that stand out that are kind of echoes of what Mike and Nick have already mentioned is the feedback loop that is built into social media, right? That is immediate and creates the kind of real-time dynamics that Mike was talking about, right? And I'm thinking especially even in the context of many young people using social media, right? Who are just trying to test out their voice and trying to find their way. And so anything that you post, right, immediately has this affirmation or lack of affirmation or just complete, dissing, shall we say, right, of anything that's been posted. And so it's that immediate feedback loop that I think is really different from all the prior communication and information technologies that then allows each of us as users to keep on adjusting, right? Like we keep on adjusting ourselves, what we want to say, right? According to the the levels of affirmation or lack of affirmation that we're receiving. And as Nick has mentioned, the thing about that loop, right, that feedback loop is that there is this third party, right, like that is involved in managing the kind of feedback that you're getting, and then managing whatever's going to show up on your feed, right, of what you perceive as reality. And so it's the feedback loop with the algorithm that's tucked behind it, right, that's managing that loop, that I think is, like Nick mentioned, just incredible amounts of power on the third parties, on their part. But for us as users, I think it creates this really different kind of dynamic as we are trying to communicate and as we are trying to figure out where we are in the world, right? Not just young people, but any of us. We're trying to locate our voice within the larger landscape of what all the other voices are saying.
Nick, I'm going to take a moment and ask you just a quick question. Because I think of radio, television, for example, also kind of constituting a third person in the transaction, right? So there's the third person aspect is not necessarily unique to social media. Its algorithmic character is. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you saw the difference between what amounts to the third person in the context of social media as compared to the radio station, the network, the television network, which also had a very powerful. I can hear somebody maybe arguing that, and even more powerful, even more power in that context, because they could, four stations sort of dominated what Americans saw of the world in the era of mass media in the mid 20th century. Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I think they certainly were the middlemen, and they would. CNN would tell a different bend to a story than Fox News did. And that, I think we're still accustomed to that. I think the difference is the scale. And so when you have, let's say 7 different channels describing a story, you can actually look at all 7 and then see the differences of the 7. But then when you've got social media and it's at this vast scale, we've got billions of people telling a story about a certain thing. At that point, it's tough to see and look at each person's viewpoints and say, oh, they're a little bit more left, these guys are a little bit more right, so that you can kind of calibrate in your mind. But now it's so broad, and I think really it's our ability to filter information. I think that is where we're lacking as human beings. I think if we're bombarded by a feed, it's very difficult to figure out which things are more important than not, especially if you have so many of them. And so with that, you're more at a, what is it? I don't want to say disadvantage, but you're more influenced by these cases because you've got so many differing opinions pulling you in different directions. And if you, and this is another analogy I think a friend told me was, back in the day, if you had like the village idiot and he would say things that were crazy, that those voices were just left to him, and maybe there was another idiot that would talk together in the corner, and that was it. But now you've got a million villages, you got a million idiots, and then now you're magnifying all their voices together, and now they've got an echo chamber saying like, hey man, you're right and you're right too, and then they elevate themselves, and then now you've got this bubble that's being created that normally wouldn't have created had you not had this level of scale. So that's a kind of like a different angle to social media, but definitely what ends up happening is a magnification of voices that maybe shouldn't have been magnified. Whereas back in the radio and TV, you've got very specific voices, and if you become more fallible, then you're kind of off the grid at that point. Whereas now, there's no who defines what's fake, right? It's kind of hard.
Well, and don't you think that, when you talk to journalists, they would say, well, at least we had some we had a code of ethics, right? Like we had certain guidelines that were guiding how we were the third party, right, or the other. And so now it's as you mentioned, it's the goals of engagement that are driving, right, what gets on our feed and what gets affirmed. And so and it's the lack of transparency in understanding what the algorithm is about. So I think those are all the control has always been there, but it's a very different kind of control.
Yeah, totally.
Mike, thanks for jumping in and keeping the conversation there while I had some technical difficulties. It makes sense that it would happen during this conversation, I guess. I'd like to ask a practical question for all of you again. And that is, I mean, this is kind of the main topic for tonight. What are some concrete practices that you've been able to put in place to help you use social media more wisely? Felicia, I know you've written quite a bit about this in your book, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. But Michael and Nick, very interested in how you think about this as well, whether it's for yourself, for your children, other communities that you might play a role in. What have you found that's helpful?
Yeah, I think, one of my experiences with social media is the ways in which once I'm on it and once I'm really engaged in it, like I've posted things and I'm waiting to see people's responses, I find that I become incredibly preoccupied with what's going on that feed, right? Whether I'm at work or with my family or whatever, it's like half of my mind is like wondering what's going on. And so I think the challenge of living with social media is how do we live life and not be driven by it, right? Not be constantly mastered by it in many ways. And so I think for me, there's just been like, I'm interested in like small changes, like small adjustments that can just kind of tamp down the effect of that drivenness that I might have. And so, something as simple as making sure that I shut off all the notifications, right? Like that it's not just constantly interrupting whatever I'm doing, on my phone. It's not just the sound, it's like the visual too. Like I just can't have it popping up. But then even smaller things like, hey, maybe, and we talk about this in my family is, during the first 15 minutes of your waking moments, let's not jump on our phones. And the last 15 minutes before we go to bed, let's make that a sacred time. And so I think it's being intentional about the times that we are going to engage it, rather than have the feed and its notifications be driving our day and our kind of mental preoccupations and where our spirits are.
Great, thank you. Michael, Nick, what do you guys think?
So one of the things that I would point to is that I don't have a smartphone. I have a dumb phone. It's an old flip phone. And immediately upon saying this, I want to clarify, I don't think this is particularly virtuous on my part. In fact, it's a sign of my lack of virtue. The fact that I would not trust myself with one. I know it would be just bad news for me, and my discipline isn't up to the challenge. And also to acknowledge that a lot of this is in some respects, can be framed as a kind of luxury. I'm not required to have one. Others are. I don't depend upon one in the way that others might for their work, for their employment, et cetera. So it's a choice I've made, knowing myself and wanting to put limits, right? So that it's I think of the way we relate to different technologies can involve certain negotiations, but sometimes refusals. And for my part, that has seemed like a wise refusal, and that immediately sort of creates a kind of a fence around me at certain times, right? So if I'm sitting in front of my laptop, obviously the access is there. I may have a tool like Freedom, an app that kind of shuts down social media for program times, which can be helpful. But if I'm away from my laptop, then I don't have to kind of process that temptation constantly, right? So that's one practice. I'll also share one that I've stolen from Andy Crouch. I heard him talk about this recently, where he decided that not only would he kind of not start his day with a smartphone in the way that Felicia described, but that he would also not check into any kind of social media feed until he had been outside, until he had some experience of the non-human world, right? And I thought that was really interesting and a simple thing that could be quite valuable.
Yeah, and I think I'm in the same boat as Michael and Felicia. The theme is limiting, which is unfortunate. It's kind of like, why is this in our lives if we always have to limit this thing? Like it's this dangerous thing. And I agree with Michael, it's dangerous. And so because of its addictiveness. So I just limit myself from using it. I just try not to go there. I barely post things because like Felicia said, if I do, then now I'm thinking the next time, what are people going to think about this thing? And I think the most important thing to do, and both of these individuals have done that, is a self-audit. When you're messing around with this stuff, what is happening to your brain? What are you thinking about, and what are you being lured into and wondering, like, is this good for me or not good for me? I think that's the most important thing, because everyone's different, and they're going to be accustomed to different things. My wife looks at Christmas stuff all the time, and so she understands, like, when there's a Christmas tree, she's going to go deep into that Christmas tree feed. And for me, it's a little different. But I think auditing yourself and understanding really, where are your weaknesses? Where are the things that you have less agency over? And then really guarding yourself against those things. I think that's really the best thing we can do until we can redeem social media.
I think that's really insightful. That idea of a self audit. It's good to ask. To sort of steal a phrase from Augustine. What do I love when I love my Twitter feed? Right? Like what is it that I'm after? Like what is it that my heart is wanting? And chances are that what it is that we're really wanting, or what it is that we're really made for, is actually something good. And one of the questions we can ask is, what is it that we, not just how do we limit ourselves from this technology, but what do we go to instead? What do we go toward instead? And maybe that's part of the wisdom of that being outside, like not just not checking the phone, but going out and looking at the sky first. I think that's really helpful. So I want to ask at least one more question for all of you before we switch to Q&A. Let me remind everybody, we would love to hear your questions. So if you've got them, now's the time to go to Slido and enter questions that you'd like our panelists to answer in our last 30 minutes. The last question I want to be sure to ask all of you before we go there. We try to turn things upbeat a little bit here. Michael, I as we were gathering together earlier this evening, I mentioned that I saw in your essay yesterday in the Convivial Society, you mentioned something called Bettridge's Law, which is totally new to me, probably new to most people. Bettridge's Law, I guess, says that if you're looking at a newspaper and you see a headline that ends in a question mark, it can always be answered no. And when I saw that, I laughed, because I almost chose the name for tonight's event, Can Social Media Be Redeemed, with a question mark. And now I'm glad I didn't do that, because I wouldn't want to imply the answer, oh, it's just beyond redemption. So my question for you is, what gives you hope? What gives you hope for living in a world with social media where it is a part of our world? What excites you? What is it that staves off the despair that I know tempts my heart? What do you guys think?
I'm going to say something just kind of very obvious, is that, like, for me, as someone who's been watching the technology conversation for a while now, or just I'm actually really thankful and hopeful that people, our culture, that we are even at this place of awareness, right? That we were not at 15, 20 years ago at all, right? That there is an increasing awareness and about what our digital technologies are doing to us as we are also creating, and that there are live questions about, well, what are the alternatives, right? And that the alternatives, like you said, aren't about just chucking it all, right? Even though there are days when we just think we just got to burn it all, right, and start over. But that there might be other ways of doing this, right? Other ways of doing social media, other ways of connecting, other ways of amplifying voices that deserve to be amplified, right? And so I think, conversations like this and, people like Nick doing what he's doing, it's like, that's exciting to me, because I think we're on the right arc, like we're moving in the right direction, even though I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So I'm just grateful that we're even talking, because I don't think these conversations were even happening, 20 years ago.
I'll go ahead and follow up on that, because I think my answer would be very, very similar. I'm encouraged by the degree to which we're being more reflective about the role of technology in our lives. That's a kind of backhanded compliment, I suppose, to the world of social media or digital media, that it has forced us to think more deeply about this, because it has generated a lot of angst and strain and stress. But I think that thoughtfulness is important, especially if it will push us to remember the goodness of the limits that are inherent in the human condition, right? So I think that this is a kind of fundamental point for us, or at least for me, that I think about the technological landscape from the perspective of my faith. We're being pushed in a lot of ways to imagine that we can discard the body, do without it, decenter our experience from the limits of the body, whether those are temporal or spatial, to forget the body's place in the larger world around us, the non-human built world, and to the degree that the strain that maybe we might feel, that a lot of people sort of intuitively now feel when they use social media, when they get anxious, when they leave their smartphone behind, that it maybe pushes us to reconsider the goodness of those limits, instead of seeing them only as limits to be transcended.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think we can harp on all the negative consequences of a particular change, or we can also look at some of the positive things that social media brings. Just a massive number of things, just amazing connection points that would never been available without it. News travels extremely fast, so you have extremely efficient economies. You've got businesses people would have never been able to create had YouTube not been created. There's just a litany of positive things for our society that I think we should never diminish, even though there are consequences to any tool that there is. There's always a downside. There's always a trade-off. The hopefulness comes kind of like how Felicia was talking, like we're having the conversations right now and it's front and center and people care. And in working in big tech companies, the big tech companies care as well. It's not like we're out to get people and like to do people harm. All of our leadership cares deeply about the betterment of humanity. And I think that's extremely important to them. And they're optimizing for that in their minds. It's just difficult to materialize that in the code. But those things are important. And so as powerful people start thinking about these important things, I have hope that we can course correct and adjust. And as we do our own self audits, we can kind of feel the negative impact of these things, and we're adjusting ourselves. So if we're doing that, I believe social media can do the same thing. And I mean, Apple's coming out with all these ways to limit things while we kind of fix algorithms or make them behave in a more useful way. So everyone's thinking about it. So that makes me hopeful. It's not like people are saying that these conversations are crazy or anything like that. So yeah, there's progress being made. I think it'd be great to see policy move faster, but again, policy is a bit more old school. So it'd be better to have more technologists in Congress and that sort of thing to help move that conversation forward, because I feel like policy is definitely an important voice here. And also, I would challenge the church as well to step up here, because it's easy to blame the technology firms and the tool makers to say like, look, you made a gun and people are now shooting each other. But I would encourage churches, anybody that's well versed in what a good society is, those entities ought to be getting involved, ought to be getting in the conversations and speaking into what good is, what is good for us. We know decreasing self-esteem for a teenager, that's bad. That's an obvious thing. There's other nuances that aren't as clear. But if we can enumerate those things and saying these behaviors are bad, and here's how you can measure them. Here's how you can measure them based on your internet usage or based off of the things that you post or whatnot. If we had those kind of metrics, we could build those things into our algorithms to recommend things that might be good for you. Minus those metrics, it's kind of tough to do that. You're guessing and choosing, trying to figure out what trade-offs to make a better, more robust recommendation engine. But if you don't have those metrics, how can you optimize for them? So I almost feel like the more we can provide those kinds of measuring mechanisms for goodness, or even human. Imagine if we had a human flourishing index, and then we can put a number to each piece of content, how much human flourishing that would create. Now we're talking. Now we can train our machines to optimize for those things. But minus that, it's extremely difficult. So yeah, but I think people are having the right conversations. I think we can get to some metrics at some point that we can gear some of these computers to look at.
Awesome. Yeah. And the challenge to the church is well received. And I think you gave a good charge for institutions also like the ones that Mike and I are heading up, trying to engage these conversations and bridging church and university in some of these things. Well, listen, we've got some questions coming in from the audience, and so I'm gonna to switch to these, and at least these first ones are not directed at anyone in particular. So whoever would like to jump in. The first one asks, can you talk about the privacy concerns with social media and what companies like Instagram and Facebook are doing with all of that big data? How should we think about protecting ourselves? Do we need to be concerned with protecting ourselves? Is there a moral angle here?
I'll make just a brief comment, and I would say that a lot of in one respect, the old idea of privacy or breaches of privacy, right, is that someone is listening to us, Big Brother is listening to us, the government's listening to us. I'm not sure that's the role of data collection in a digital environment. It tends to reduce to a much more simple question, I think, which is how can I sell you something? Or more recently, I would say, how can I automate your purchasing so that you don't even have to make the decision to buy something? And so from one perspective, I think what we would want to be concerned about isn't specific to the technology. It's actually a much older problem, which is the way in which consumerism kind of shapes the self and our understanding of the good life and our habits. And not to forget that it's, I sometimes would kind of talk about this in terms of not a technological system, but a techno-economic system, both of which reinforce one another in important ways, as they have throughout Western history. So in one respect, one reason to be concerned about data collection is to remember that the aim of it in some respects is just to continue to generate a sense of the self as primarily a consumer. And I think that's a long-standing concern, for Christians.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we got to look at what privacy means, and if it's a generalized anonymized set of data that you contribute to, I don't know how much privacy you're losing from surfacing that data, but like Michael was sharing, it's about consumerism and recommending things that you might want to purchase or you might want to engage with. So to that degree, they're not like looking in your journal and seeing your private thoughts. So to that extent, it's not that, but but if you are concerned with guarding your private data, even though it's anonymized, I think there's controls in all the different platforms. And I think that's becoming more of a policy in terms of being able to delete all your stuff or go incognito. So there are ways to guard yourself, but I wouldn't be too concerned. Me personally, this is just my personal opinion, because then these platforms are just going to recommend things that are more useful for me. So it actually helps me to see something more relevant. So I'm less concerned about that than like them abusing my privacy.
I think privacy is definitely something that we need to be concerned with. And I'm not thinking in terms of consumerism so much, but actually more in terms of, you know, and I'm not here, I'm moving outside of the anonymized sort of data. But it's the problem of the leaky container, right? You're letting one company take certain kinds of data about you, right? That is for one purpose, right? And as a user or client, you don't have control, or you don't know what's going to happen to that data, right? If that's going to go somewhere else. It's going to go into, does law enforcement eventually have access to it? Does your insurance company eventually have access to it? And so I think the collection of the data and the degree to which we as users may not either be educated in how we can control the data, right? Or the site is set up with defaults that make it just onerous to be able to control your data, right? I think all of those are barriers and difficulties that make managing one's data a concern, right? And it's one thing if you're an upper middle class, well-educated person, right? And has bandwidth to do all of that. And it's another if you're just trying to get a certain social service, right? But needing to then deliver a lot of data, give over a lot of fairly personal data that you eventually don't have any, you don't know how it's going to get used and moved in the future.
Great. So this next question has to do with the impact of the way that social media can collapse and minimize space and place. So here's the question. Earlier we talked about immediacy, middleman, and scale. When crazy groups came up, the questioner also noticed that it seems like removing space, that is physical distance, and place, that is a communal locale, also seem important. Does that impact us distinctly? Could you comment on that?
I think that's absolutely correct. And I was reading a book by a Chinese geographer, Yifu Tuan, I believe was the name, and he made this interesting observation about how place used to have the function of regulating the flow of information for us. So what we were most aware of what was most immediate to us in our circumstances. Think even before telegraphic communication, which is the first time that communication sped up beyond the speed of a horse, and the longer things took to get to us, right? That itself regulated the flow of information for us. It was the opposite of the immediacy we now experience, and so we've lost that kind of self-regulating feature of place and space because of technologies that kind of erode that because of their speed. And then there's also this question of, what matters most to us. This is an observation that goes beyond social media. Again, I think Kierkegaard was making a point similar to this, shortly into the era of the telegraph, which is that we become more interested in some respects in what is happening far away from us, and more knowledgeable about things that are happening far away from us than about our own communities, whether that be, our own church, our neighborhood, our town, our city. It desituates us, and that has, I think, a lot of important consequences.
Yeah, I think the issue with place is interesting, because that can sound, there's specificity to place, but what we often forget is that our social institutions are actually built around those places. And so there's the sociologist Barry Wellman who talks about how communication technologies have often required shifts in these institutions that exist in specific places. So the example is, in the past, your family, right, was in a place, a home, right, a physical place. And if you wanted to go and talk to someone in that family, you had to knock on the door, right? And someone would open the door, right? And so the institution of the family was integrally involved in regulating and navigating, right, the kinds of communications and relationships that you had. You bring in the telephone, you bring in social media and all these other technologies that go around, right, that go around the institution of the family, right? So you're thinking, parents are having a lot harder time, right, managing their children's world, right? It's these institutions that are rooted in place, right, that suddenly do not have the kinds of powers and capacities that they used to have, right? And so there's just a lot of confusion and a lot of adjustments that these institutions now have to figure out, and that can be incredibly challenging.
Yeah, I totally agree. The current paradigms on policing, not even policing, but even managing space, that's going to be completely out the door. With this metaverse conversation, we're going to have place is going to be a completely different idea, and it's going to be augmented and also virtual. And so how are we going to be able to police or manage in that manner? It's going to be completely a different story. So I think this is a really deep and interesting question that we can spend an hour talking about. And yes, I think these elements, as they get removed, as the internet basically puts us all as immediate neighbors, also language goes out the door too. Even if we spoke different languages, we could use technology to communicate with each other. We are closer than we've ever been. And because of that, crazy groups will grow, and they will always begin to grow. So it's a matter of how do we work with these crazy groups? How do we work with people that might have vastly extreme or differing opinions than us, given the landscape? Because it's only going to get broader and bigger. I don't really see that slowing down.
Yeah, I agree. This is a deep one, and I was waiting for someone to bring up the metaverse. That's another one that we could talk about for a long time. Here's a question. A couple people have asked this. Is there a particular biblical text or a verse that you find yourself returning to when thinking about how to faithfully create or use social media?
I always think a lot about the verse in the Psalms that calls us to be still. Because for me, so much of our digitally saturated lives make stillness incredibly difficult, just incredibly difficult. And so the exhortation, right, and reminder that so much of our lives and our understanding of what to do with our lives actually comes out of stillness rather than gathering more information or posting something, right? Everything that that the digital landscape is calling us to do, it's a very different action. It's a very different posture that we are called to. So I find myself thinking about being still a lot.
Yeah, my mind jumps to setting your minds on the things above and not on the earthly things. And I think as a user, I think, and this is really for anything that you do, I believe if eating a slice of pizza is going to help you set your mind on the things of heaven, and go eat that slice of pizza. If it's not, and if these activities are going to draw you away and let you get really pulled into the weeds of the world, I think then maybe you ought to stop doing those activities or limit those activities. So yeah, it's just, I think this is just a really a general way to look at things. And even relationships, should you be hanging out with that person if they're going to keep you focused on making lots of money, for example, or you hang out with that other person if they're thinking more eternally. So, same kind of applies for social media usage.
I've been thinking a bit recently about some portions of the Sermon on the Mount, and specifically the injunction that we be anxious for nothing. And also a general observation, not a verse per se, but a general observation that I've been reflecting on, which is that I don't think one ever finds Christ hurried in the Gospels, right? Lots of other human emotions manifested by Christ in his humanity, from anger to grief, sorrow, joy, but never hurried, which is our default, I think, our default sort of state of mind. And so to think about what it might mean to sort of reject the imperative to control, to manage. I think one way that social media tempts us is with the dream of managing social relations, keeping them safe at a distant, carefully curated. I think, which is why maybe some people now find phone conversations very awkward, because you don't have that power to kind of think very carefully or curate your responses. And so there's this imperative to control that I think is a part of modern technology, generally speaking, and setting these aside, setting that imperative aside, being open to a degree of risk and vulnerability, and simply receiving our experience as a gift rather than as a project to be managed. Those are some of the reflections that I think I've been thinking about generally, but that can apply also to our use of social media.
Yeah, great. Those are all helpful. Here's one. So Felicia, you actually alluded to this a little bit in your opening remarks, but you might be able to elaborate, and then I'd love Michael and Nick's thoughts on this too. The question is, youth and university students are in formative years and may find it more challenging to develop coping mechanisms, the kinds of things that you guys have been discussing, to limit ourselves. Do we see any trend in young people to decouple from social media due to some negative experiences? If so, what impact might that have?
Are there trends? Is that the first half of that question?
Are there trends in young people decoupling from social media due to a negative experience? I'm thinking of you talked about the changing reaction to your idea of a fast.
Yeah, right.
In what you said at the beginning.
Yeah. The decoupling is kind of interesting. So if any of us can remember, it's always time moves very quickly in the tech world. But if we can remember back to Cambridge Analytica, remember that whole thing? It feels like a long time ago. But when that all kind of blew up in Facebook's face, it was actually the younger people that got off Facebook faster. And of course, there's generational kind of, affinities related to different platforms. But I think there's definitely generationally, even though I think those of us who are older often harp on the younger people as being more tied in to their devices, it's not actually obvious that that's the case, right? That older generations, us Gen Xers, we're actually pretty tied in and pretty stubborn about getting off. And whereas I think with young people, there's been little pockets and signs of people being more willing to get off of their social media for a season. There's really interesting anecdotes about kids who go to summer camps where they are not allowed to use their devices. And in the beginning, it's incredibly painful. But then after the week, everyone's like amazed and celebratory and even kind of sad that they're getting their phones back, because they're all like, wasn't that amazing, right? None of us had to feel ignored by each other, and we were just free, right? And so I think there is a kind of appetite that is still there, that I think for those of us who have young people in our lives, whether it's in our families or schools or churches, wherever it might be, I think so much of it depends on whether we can create situations and environments and experiences that remind them or introduce them to lived experiences that are not related to their digital, that are freed from that, right? And this gets back to the Andy Crouch example of going outside, right? Is just like, there's something else out there, right, that you can be doing that might nourish you and feed you in a really substantial way, and trying to stir that appetite so that they can come back to it.
Michael or Nick, anything to add to that one?
I would only add that I think it is, I find something similar happens when I talk to, say, college age students about social media and make observations of the sort that we've been making. I think there's a realization that I sometimes quip that the arc of digital media bends toward exhaustion. And I think there's just a sense of that, whether it's been articulated or not. And then the project of identity management, I think, is interesting because it also is exhausting. And I do wonder, the first the millennial generation that kind of comes of age with smartphones, or well, the younger millennials anyway, with smartphones and social media, as I suggested earlier, kind of bring into it this kind of televisual ideal of cultivating the image and managing very carefully. I wonder if for younger generations, the social media experience will not be very different than that. And I'm not entirely sure how I would describe it, but I think a suspicion about that capacity to manage the pristine image. I think the net effect of social media over the long haul is to collapse that dream for those that kind of have given themselves over to it, or to see the fallaciousness of it. So changing attitudes towards social media among the young, I think, is what I would look for. Maybe a little bit more skepticism, and certainly a little bit more skepticism about, again, that ideal of the neatly curated identity.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think usage for things like this is really a pendulum. If you look back, and privacy is a good proxy for this. When you look back before any of this stuff existed, people were extremely not private. They would share everything, and they'd blog about everything, and they'd just post everything. And then people started thinking, wait, what am I doing? Everyone knows everything about myself. Let me dial things down, and things started to move back into the private sector, where people were more private about things. And now I feel like things are moving back into a selectively not private engagement. And I think that's where we're at right now. And I think it's just going to go back and forth. And I don't have any data on this, but I believe the youth are going to just do the same thing. They're going to start sharing things more selectively, perhaps like Michael shared, more raw with less filters on it, to be a more real representation of what's happening in their lives. But yeah, things are just going to shift back and forth. But I think the thing not to do as a Christian would be to completely decouple, because if you completely decouple, then you have no context anymore. If someone talking about how they're addicted to their Instagram feed, or you have no idea to escape, or I mean, not to escape, but to relate or to connect with them, because you're completely outside of it. So just to stay relevant, just to understand how the culture is morphing and shifting, we ought to not to completely ditch everything, but yeah, it's kind of a separate topic. But yeah, definitely there's this swing coming where people are more apprehensive is a strong word, but they're a bit more careful about things.
Right. Yeah, thanks. So the next question we have here says that now that Frances Haugen, that's the Facebook whistleblower, now that she has drawn attention to the algorithms that drive traffic and therefore revenue, what would be a biblical way of tamping down on the damage that false information and inflammatory statements do to harm others and fuel conflict?
Go ahead, Michael.
So I don't know that there's any answer that is adequate to that question, right? And I've again, this is somewhat provocatively, and I would tone it down a bit if pressed, but I've thought that in the digital context, all information is disinformation, right? Because it's the scale of it that matters, as Nick was describing earlier. And so the idea that we can clamp down on disinformation sort of assumes that everyone would agree on what counts as disinformation, right? This is part of the problem we're experiencing right now. And then that even the effort to do that by a platform will eventually become a front in the culture war. Because there's this question about who gets to decide what is the good information or what counts as disinformation. While we might presently be able to say, well, I can think of some obvious examples, there will be other communities that will take exception to that. And those communities in the age of the scale of the internet are sizable communities. And so I don't know that there's an easy way to do that. One thing, this goes back to kind of practice, a personal practice. In the attention economy, silence is extremely powerful, I think. And what I mean by that is that even if so say I encounter in my Twitter feed something I disagree with, right? Or something that I feel should be highlighted as false or whatever. If I share it to say that, I'm sharing it, right? I'm feeding signals to the algorithm that are going to augment it or amplify it. In contexts like that, and one has to be selective here or careful or prudential in this, but the best thing to do is simply to ignore it, because in ignoring it, if I think of myself as a node in a network, then it kind of dies in my particular area of the network. And so resisting the urge to quote tweet something and say, this is the problem, blah, blah, blah with this, and simply letting it die, when it reaches you as a node in the network, right? So the power of silence in that sense, I think is very important, but cuts against the grain of the reward mechanisms of social media. Because on social media, nobody knows you're being silent, and you don't get any internet points for it.
Yeah, I totally agree with Michael. He's said it better than I was going to say. But when you look biblically, you look at love. I mean, that is engagement. Really, the opposite of love isn't hate; it's apathy. So I would do the same thing. If there's some kind of information that you feel is false or fake, I would ignore. I think that's the simplest way to go about things. Not to hate on the thing, but to really just pass by it. Yeah, I'll pause there.
I like the idea of the internet points. Can we work that in, Michael? For being silent.
Right. We'll find a metric for it.
So we're coming up on, we got about 5 minutes left. So if there are any last questions out there, get them in and I will try to get to them. But here's one specifically for Nick. So a question for Nick, do you have advice or thoughts about how churches or regular people can begin to engage the tool makers? Are there specific areas that you would want to see social media technologies develop?
Yeah, this is a pretty loaded question. My mind goes directly to church, and like I see a lot of problems with the modern day church. I don't want to get too deeply into it, but a lot, and I'm going to touch on that because I think it's important. A lot of the churches that we have are led by seminarians, and they have no workplace experience, and they don't work in tech, and so rarely do they speak from the pulpit about a person working in technology. And then what is a technologist to do when they're in some place like this doing this sort of work when they can't go to seek counsel from their leadership? And so that's a tough conversation to have. So what I would say is, for the people that are working in this world, to be a leader in your churches, to have these conversations with your leadership and with the other congregants, so that you can just put voice to these things and put labels to these things, so you can understand really, what are the conflicts that you're dealing with, and what are the struggles that you have to work through. And this is a larger faith and work conversation where a lot of people talk about faith and work, like I alluded to in the beginning. It's about tithing and evangelism, because those are the two things pastors really know. But then you ask a technologist, Christian, working at these places, and they'll say that there's just so much more. And so I would really encourage people that are working in the workplace to start leading these discussions in your churches. And as you do these things, you can not only influence the people that work in these companies, but also you can start building momentum, potentially have a movement in terms of just like what you're doing here, Nathan, is really to make that conversation front and center, and then bring it and level it up. In terms of like working directly with a company, that's more of a nuanced discussion about how to engage a particular tool maker. But there's always ways to provide feedback to those groups in terms of how they ought to make their products better. They do research studies all the time, so you can speak into those things as well. But I think the conversation needs to start in the church first and make it an important thing. And once it's an important thing, I believe that God can use those conversations to then impact neighboring areas like the companies and whatnot.
Great. Thank you. That's really helpful. This is probably our last one, and this one's specifically for Felicia. Felicia, you mentioned the importance of stillness a moment ago. How do we think about Sabbath in a digital world? And what advice would you have for cultivating a practice of stillness or Sabbath in this world that we live in?
Yeah, Sabbath. We could, like Nick said, we could go an hour here. I think the discipline, the spiritual practice of Sabbath is probably one of the most easier ones to imagine in applying to our digital lives, right? Because we can imagine taking Sabbaths from the devices, from the platforms that we would normally engage in. I think, there's so many different ways to imagine Sabbath that could be really productive. I'm thinking of, Walter Brueggemann writes about Sabbath as a resistance against consumerism, right, and capitalism, and the Pharaoh, right, system of our society. And so we can think of Sabbath as framing it as a time in which we live into the possibility, right, to say that my life isn't all this, right, that there is this space that is separate from the demands and the drivenness of the technology that characterizes so much of my life. I think really practically, though, I'll say, we were talking about confession at one point. I'm like really bad at Sabbath taking, like incredibly bad at it. To take an entire day I just find incredibly challenging. And so for me, I actually, and if there's anyone else out there that has the same sorts of problems, I like to think of Sabbath as a time of welcoming in something that is a time as a being, right? It's not just a resistance of, right, like pushing away the things that are driving me, but it's actually welcoming in this time of delight, of celebration, of grace that God is gifting to me, right? And welcoming and filling that time, even if it's 2 hours, right, on a Sunday, that I'm actively welcoming in this time of celebration of God's grace and rest for me, right? That he's permitting me to rest is a genuine gift that I can enjoy. So that's a practical way to think about it.
Great, thank you. Well, that's a wonderful place to end. We are up against our time, so we have to wrap up there. I am really grateful to all three of you, Nick, Michael, Felicia. Thank you so much. This has been rich. This has been insightful and helpful. Thank you to all of you for joining us, for your questions. I also want to thank Haley Robinson of the Veritas Forum. She ran all of the tech aspects of tonight, and Cam Jones, Octet's intern. Thanks for manning the Q&A feed. If you'd like to learn more about the Octet Collaborative, like I said, you can go to our website, octetcollaborative.org. And there's a link there where you can sign up for our newsletter so that you can hear about all future events like this. We have some other things lined up for next year. So with that, thank you all for joining us, and I will say good night.